Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for checking out the podcast. Today, we are following up with some additional questions that we didn't get to check out or ask on Sunday. So if this is your first time checking it out, you can check the link in the description and you will find a link to part one of this dialogue about mental health. So we are here with Pastor Jim and Jovanna. Thank you both for being here. So I guess let's get after it.
Let's do this.
Yeah. So something that we were talking about, but I think we could use some more clarity on. We were talking about before, Jim, is maybe you can help me, the questions for either finding a counselor, like some follow-up questions. What was help jog my memory?
One of the things I think that I would like to kind of hear Jovanna's take on is, what are the types of things we should be looking for in a counselor who's really going to take this serious? What types of questions should we be asking, and what types of follow-up should we be looking for? I've had a number of people over the years, but even recently, actually since we did the first part of this, come up to me and tell me that, one told me that he went and had been going for a little while and finally decided to try some medication based on the doctor's recommendation. And he talked about how awesome the doctor was in following up quickly, asking questions. How's this working? How do you feel? And then another person, completely unsolicited, just on their own, came up to me and said, hey, I went through this situation, ended up on medicine, and the doctor was like, all right, we'll see you in 6 months. And the medicine was, something that was hard for that person to adjust to, and ended up not actually working out. So obviously that's a bad experience. It's also a big part of the testimony that's out there in the community against medicine. And so what should we look for?
So I think that the positive and negative of mental health is that it is all based on our personalities. But what I will say is that all counselors will have like an intake, and it will have like a description of them. So in mine, there's a description, and even on my webpage, it's a description of me, the things I utilize, like
you
the
said
different
intake. What's an intake?
So an intake is that first step before you start counseling, and everybody does it different, but there's two main ways. One, it's sent to you via email, or you fill it out when you get there, and it's just like your demographics, what you're coming in for, and then there will be a little blurb about like how they do things there. Or you'll have like a formal intake where you go in and you're doing a face-to-face interview. But somewhere along the way, in between whatever steps, your counselor should inform you of their background, what they use. Most of us are considered eclectic or integrative, meaning that we use a little bit of all the different theories. And that's one thing I would say, is that if that's not happening, if you're not up to date on what your counselor's about, then that would be a red flag to me.
What about for people who have a difficult time with conflict? So, I mean, especially if you're in a really less resourceful state of mind already, and conflict is one of the things you don't manage well. Now you've come in and you sit there in that first meeting going, oh, this is a bad idea.
But I'm already here.
And I don't know how to say no. Because there are a lot of people who they don't even know how to say no when they're in a less resourceful state. Yeah. So how would they manage that?
And I think that would be the hard space for them, because that would be a skill that they would learn from their counselor. I would encourage them, though, to know that there's other options. There's so many counselors just even here in Savannah, and there's lots of Christian counselors here in Savannah. And so that would be my encouragement, is if you don't feel it, like I get where that's coming from, of like, I don't like conflict, I don't want to do that, but you're spending money. And so I wonder for them if that discomfort of spending money for something that's not helping them would override. Like, you're paying $50 to $90 and you're going week after week to something that's not helping you, I don't know if that would override feeling.
I would say there are definitely even seasons in my life where, because there's, some brief built relationship now after a week where I feel obligated, and I personally will have a hard time, in the relationship to say, hey, I'm not going to do this. Maybe this is an idea, we would say, if you can identify that that's your personality type already, you already struggle with saying no, then maybe you could request a digital initial intake so that you can do some reading beforehand, before a face-to-face. And if you're uncomfortable from what you read, maybe, because I think a lot of people actually do a lot better at stating their opinion, through social media.
And now you say that, like, send an email.
Yeah.
And so if you can't do it via human contact, like, do it over email. But I will say that most counselors, so let's say you're talking to someone and they say, oh, I need a counselor, and you give them 3 names, they can research those 3 names. And like, everybody is electronic now. Everybody has a website. Everybody has like multiple pages, some counselors on our Psychology Today. And so you can research the person before you go. And so if that's your comfort zone too, I think that that's the benefit of the culture now, is that you can research the person before you go. To answer the second question about doctors, that's the other thing, is not every doctor acts the same. That's definitely the first example, is how it should be, is having a follow-up. But what I would tell anybody if they're about to start medication, pay attention to the way it makes you feel. I mean, because you're the only one that knows your internal experience. And for some medications, it takes about 2 weeks. So you might feel some drowsiness, but if you're instantly feeling the negative side effects, discontinue that med. I've worked with parents with their kids that are on medication, and we will closely track, like, are they sleeping less? Are they eating less? And anytime I'm in that sphere with people, I want them to advocate for themselves. I want them to know that, like, hey, if you are noticing that your kid's mood is all over the place, or if your mood's all over the place, discontinue the med, call them, make an appointment, tell them it's not working. Because again, you're adding a chemical to your body, and everybody's bodies respond differently. I've had clients that are all on the same med, and all 3 of them, one had a successful run, 2 others, it wasn't good for them. But knowing that you know that stuff, your doctor doesn't know that stuff.
Which is probably why a doctor can, feel like, oh, I prescribe this all the time. There's very little blah, 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 and I'll see you in 6 months. But, you could be the exception. So what I hear you saying is, it's okay to ask questions. The first thing you need to do is figure out who you're comfortable with. And if you're not comfortable with them, you need to walk away. But you need to walk away to somebody else. So you've got to continue looking. And then if you do start treatment with somebody, if they're doing their job, they're going to take responsibility to listen. So if you're on a medicine and something doesn't feel right, contact them, and they should respond. And if they're not responding, that could be another red flag, because they should be taking it serious enough, especially if you're on medication that, obviously now they're not going to, responding and not responding are not measured by minutes. They're typically measured by days. So you have to remember you're not the only patient. So if somebody doesn't respond to you within an hour, that could just mean that they are working with other patients at that time. But give them a reasonable amount of time to respond. So and know yourself. Like I've really appreciated having people who have asked me about, like, they want to get counseling, and they've said, I know that with what I'm going through, I can't work with the opposite gender. And just know that about yourself. No, I don't think walking in with a whole bunch of biases, but if you're dealing with some kind of trauma, or you're dealing with some issue with a parent, and you know that, okay, if I go and sit across this older male, that might be a problem for me, know that. And that's okay, because there's women options. And if you're fine with whatever, then you're fine with whatever. But I think also knowing about yourself, like what works for you and what doesn't work for you. Yeah. And if a counselor gives you grief about it, then that's probably another red flag, because they should be able to go, this is, I get what you're saying. Let's help you find somebody.
Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Jim, you spoke some Sunday about wrestling with being depressed following the loss of a family member. I just realized I need to be in my mic. So, one of the questions that was asked about it was, what is, I guess, like the appropriate amount of time, or I guess you could even get into, I don't want to say like the way, but what's the appropriate time, ways to grieve the loss of loved ones, or I guess even to grieve, and then maybe we can address you're speaking of trauma too, like what are some of the, and just says what's the appropriate amount of time for grieving the loss of a loved one? What are your thoughts on that as far as grief? And
because we basically understand that grief is a normal part of who we are and how we're made up. At what point should we be concerned if we're not finding healing?
Yeah. So there is a term for that, actually. It's called complicated grief.
Okay.
And complicated grief, excuse me, is marked by its intensity. And so if it is an intense grief and there's other symptoms, so what I have on hand is a DSM, which is like the diagnostic manual. But complicated grief in its diagnostics have like an intensity. But then also in that intensity, like you don't want to live anymore. You're overly preoccupied with the loss of a loved one, because in a grief cycle, you will cycle through things. And so when it becomes complicated grief is when there's such an intensity where the person does not want to go on. And there's other diagnostics, like it's coupled also with maybe even considering dying yourself.
Okay.
And having really deep guilty feelings. But the difference between the two is its intensity. If you look up grief, though, it will say 6 months to 4 years. And so with grief, it can be that long. And I think simply because when a person is grieving, it will come in waves. And that is completely normal. It's normal for it to, be really intense the first month, but then it lessens. But then you see something that reminds you of the person. Holidays, birthdays, anything significant will trigger it again. And it will lessen over the years. But it's not uncommon for somebody. I was talking with a guy, and he lost his dad 20 years ago, and he said Christmas still gets him. Like, he's able to live his day-to-day life, but every Christmas he feels it, and that is a part of the grief cycle as well. So that's completely normal. When it would be abnormal is if a year down the line you're not getting out of bed, you can't function as you typically would function, and you're also very preoccupied with dying yourself, or you don't want to go on, or you're feeling really intense guilty feelings. There's other diagnostics that go in it, but most of the diagnostics is I think you have to reach 2 to 4 in one category and 2 to 4 in another category.
Okay.
So it's sort of similarly, people grieve in different ways, but it's almost similarly, you spoke on Sunday about how the intrusive nature of a number of these disorders, and so I guess that would be similarly characteristic of complicated grief.
And so that's good to know for us. It's also good to know for the people that we do life with. And so it's somebody who's walking through a loss, that, if they're still grieving and it's been 3 months, that's a normal, that could be healthy.
I mean, even for me, I find that really helpful. And I guess in encouraging that I don't know, I feel as if it gives me, or even someone who's listening, perhaps like permission to basically just like feel it and actually like you have permission to deal with it, however long that might actually take for you. It's whether it is a few years or whatever it takes. It's actually you just take the time that you need to deal with it, and there's nothing wrong with that. Which
I had this epiphany.
Nice.
Anybody who spends any time around me knows that I'm always evaluating how to be a good dad, take raising my children very seriously, and walking through that grieving process with the loss of my grandmother. I think the epiphany I had in the midst of that, and I've shared this before, but was that it was because grieving was okay, because I heard people telling me grieving was okay. I also thought, well, then it's good for me to grieve in front of people I trust. And so I did not try to go and hide my grief from my kids. And I remember one specific moment where I was in the backyard on a, man, I always forget what you call those things. You tie them between two trees. A hammock. A hammock.
An Eno.
We had a hammock, and I was back there, and Carmen and the kids came out, and I just was crying. And Carmen was like, hey, y'all leave daddy alone, go back inside. And that was where it really hit me. I was like, I mean, one day they're going to be walking through this with, in the natural order of things, they'll be walking through this with the loss of us, And so I think it's okay for them to see me walk through this to help give them some tools down the road. Because I think we do a lot of times we can do a good job at teaching our kids how to have fun, how to work hard, but the things that are really difficult and complicated, we kind of close the door and leave them on the outside. And then now we're adults and we're like, I don't really know how my parents dealt with that. I don't know how they walked through that. I don't know, any reason that what I'm saying doesn't make sense or is unhealthy.
So
no, I think that's perfectly healthy, because I think that is, interestingly, that's the question that one of my favorite questions to ask clients is, like, whatever they're coming in for, if it's having difficulties grieving a situation, because you can also grieve the death of a dream, marriage, you're grieving those things or fighting. And I would ask them, did you ever have this modeled for you? And most people will say no. Like, I never saw my parents fight, or I never saw my parents cry. And so there's that thing in you that doesn't, like, that almost is like, is this okay? Because I don't even know how to do this. And I think that for grief, when I do grief counseling, that's the thing I get the most is like, how do I do this? And it's whatever your body feels like doing. If you need to cry and you can't cry right now because you're at work, that's okay, but cry. Like, if you need to just sit on your couch and eat Pringles, like, don't stay there, don't wallow. But in your grief cycle, some days you're going to be smiling and happy. And then I found that people feel guilty about that because they're like, well, should I be happy? Yeah. It's going to be a literal circle where you will hit acceptance, but then you can fly to anger and you can fly to guilt. And then you can go to the crying part. It's a circle, and that's okay for it to be that way.
Interestingly, what you were just saying made me realize that it was even in the midst of those conscious decisions to grieve, in front of my family, that some of the healing took place. Because if I had been behind the closed door, laying in the bed under the covers, then I wouldn't have seen my kids running and playing and kicking the ball. And because I was trying to model being healthy, I actually put myself in a healthier place. And I think that it helped me.
Yeah.
So just interesting.
So and with that in mind, so one of the questions that was submitted was, how do we prepare our children for the loss of a loved one or a heartbreaker thing? So I guess, what I'm hearing you say is basically just do it well in front of them.
Yeah, no, and I think definitely, like, do things in an age appropriate way, but I do
What
think,
might that look like?
I mean, I wouldn't sit down with a 3-year-old and have a deep discussion about our feelings, but I think that labeling those feelings for your children, like if your kid comes in from school and they're upset about something, acknowledging that they're upset. And so since we are thinking, feeling, doing creatures, hitting those quadrants,
Sure.
Like, what do you think about this? Like, in teaching them the process, like, what are you going to do about this? And Like, what do you feel about this? And we might all be weaker in one area, but that is an opportunity. But I also think letting them see it, just like what you said, because it is not uncommon for me to be sitting across from somebody and then reflect back and be like, no, I never saw mom and dad fight, or I never saw mom or dad cry, or if I did see them cry, they never saw a resolution. And what's interesting is kids are aware, but your mind doesn't interpret that like, well, maybe like mom, after she was crying, like journaled, or maybe she did these things. Like they never saw the end, or they know their parents fought, but they didn't ever see a resolution to the fighting or whatnot. So I think modeling those things for them is key. But then if they are going through it, as they're walking through it, if your teenager is having in the middle of a breakup, allowing them to experience their feelings and passing down things, because you can't give what you don't have. And so I think that's why we have so many talks about self-care for ourselves and how to be mentally healthy, because I think that stuff passes down. Like people who have healthy interactions with their parents will say like, no, I saw my parents disagree, but I also saw them resolve conflict. And so I know how to resolve conflict, but they might be married to someone whose story is different. Like mom and dad would leave the house and they would come back and things would be fine. Like quick little funny story, but I had a guy friend and a female friend. They were married to each other. I don't know why I told the story that way, but that's what happened.
This started weird. Go ahead.
But they were married, and they were been married for 20 years, and they were sharing that like when they would fight, he would leave the house, and she just would not understand like why is he doing that. And one time she asked him like, why is it when we fight you leave? And he's like, well, that's how my parents did it. And when they started talking about it, he thought that things got fixed that way. Like he didn't understand that his parents went behind the closed door and they talked and then they came out when it was resolved. He literally thought like, oh yeah, you just like walk away.
Absence makes the heart grow
and then
fonder.
You come
I'm
back
gone,
and then it's fine. But
Yeah.
he had never seen like healthy, like he saw them disagree, but he never saw like the healthy
resolution.
And I think that is modeling is key for our kids.
I'll add one more thought that just came to my mind, and that is, we talk about how awesome God as a creator is, and you go all the way back to the garden, and there were consequences that kind of befell the decisions that were made, and those consequences went beyond just Adam and Eve. Judgment was on Adam and Eve, but consequences were taken to the whole world. Anyway, it's interesting that as we talk about loss, God created loss cycles for us immediately that were way shorter and quicker than others. And so, I remember the first loss I experienced was that of a dog, and kind of grieving through the loss of Snowball. And then, in the natural order of things, you're going to experience several levels of loss if you're given that opportunity. And, grandparents, what I'm saying, like the people who are older and a little bit more disconnected in your family. And then that ultimately prepares you for some of the loss cycles that will be a lot more difficult. So anyway, it just made me think about how like there's even like in God's creation kind of a buildup of preparing us for that in the world around us.
So when you going back when we were talking about complicated grief, you mentioned the idea of even like wanting to die yourself. Does that, how does that look with, there ends up being like suicidal, like ideation or suicidal thoughts? Like, is it different when it's complicated grief, or what is, help me understand how does suicidal thoughts play into, perhaps depression or grief or
it could be more or less the same. I think that when we use the term ideation versus intent, like they're the same, but there's like a slight difference between the two. So suicidal ideation is you're preoccupied with the thought of dying, but you do not have a plan. And so this is a person who's like, I just want to give up. I feel hopeless. I want to die. And if you were to follow up with them with like, do you know how you would do it? There is no plan. Like, I don't know, or I'm not brave enough might be the follow-up. The intent would be, yes, I know exactly how I would do it. I would get my pills, or I would do this, or I'd do that. There's an intent. There's an active plan. That one's more dangerous. And they can slip to that depending.
So I guess with someone who has perhaps like intent, does that necessarily mean just because perhaps like they have a plan, does that mean that they do intend to follow through? I get that there's obviously the word intent is there, but is it like the fact that they're just thinking about it, or is it, I mean, I don't know, maybe I am just kind of making it, I feel like it's redundant as I ask the question because of ideation versus intent. But I mean, even like makes it a bit lighter, like in my own life, just because I make a plan to do something doesn't mean that I do that. Is it just something that like they, perhaps in the same way ideation would be, they just simply think about it, but intent could be they're simply thinking about like how they would do it. And it's, I don't know, because I feel like intent might be more dangerous for a person, almost definitely, but it doesn't necessarily, I feel like, or maybe it does. Does it demand that they are, I'm trying to think of how to ask the question.
Well, like it makes me think of one of the things that I noticed just kind of in doing some generalized research on the types of things that people say and do, and looking at it from like an online perspective, and no intent to do it, but the feeling of it and the acknowledgement of the feeling of it manifests itself in different ways, like a student who is at finals and hating everything about their life in that moment, and then they're online putting some comment, wish I could die, followed by a happy face emoji. Like what is that supposed to mean to everybody else? And typically there's probably no intent there. There's just this hopeless feeling versus somebody who's like, I'm done with life, and they're entertaining the thoughts of, man, what would be the best way to do this, or the timing to do this, or even maybe thinking about, well, who would I hurt if I do this? And long term, those people, it might not even happen immediately because they might go, well, this would hurt this person too much, but over time they begin to kind of like justify it. And then that's why somebody can, 5 years later with the same person in their life, take their life because now they've justified that action. But then there are people who they know they hit these places where they feel hopeless and they just kind of accept it.
There's a pain scale. So if we look at it like a pain scale of like, so someone has an active plan, so they're feeling that they've been thinking about dying for a while, now they have a plan. If we put them on a scale, I would throw them at like 9, meaning they might not do it today, they might not do it in a month, but if something pushes them over the head, that plan now becomes activated. And so even if we think about it like, oh yeah, I have a plan that I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to go, and then, let's say you go to the doctor and your doctor says like, you're really unhealthy, then that activates that plan. Like, now something is that catalyst moment and like in which change should come.
Sure.
And I think because I've listened to it that I can hear the difference. I don't ever want people to get bogged down in like feeling like they have to learn the distinctions. But I do want to encourage people that if you have someone in your life that is saying things that are scaring you and that are hopeless and dark, ask them if they have a plan. Ask them if they're safe. And if they're not safe, then there's like, you can even research like what you should do. And most say either call 911 or call the National Suicide Hotline, or go to them, make sure they're safe, make sure they're surrounded by people, make sure the pills are gone, make sure the weapon or whatever. And so to answer the question about like, what does intent really mean? That means there's an active plan in their mind, and maybe it won't start today, but if they get bullied one more time, it's activated. Right. Yeah. Or if my boss yells at me one more time, it's activated. Like, so that's what makes the key difference, because there's that feeling, that intrusive thought of like, I want to die, things would be better if I wasn't here, is also something to be concerned about, but that's something that is not as like, call the police, they need to be hospitalized, because once you activate that cycle, that is a process that they're now in. Does that make sense? So I wouldn't put a person who is like, I'm thinking about dying, I wouldn't kickstart them into that process. I would kickstart the person who has a plan.
Yeah, that is just helpful for me to understand, because again, it's almost sort of I don't want to say like semantics, but it is a nuanced thing when talking about it, because again, it's the words that in them makes it feel a bit different, but that is really helpful, at least for me. I guess at what point you were talking about that, do we, and I have encountered this personally, but you were talking about they need to be hospitalized. What are instances where you think that type of thing is necessary? This isn't one that got submitted, but just kind of thinking about that. When should, or under what circumstances is that even available? So I've had people who are trying to figure out, like they say, I don't know, a friend of mine on Facebook was reaching out, and I guess they really are desperate because they're putting it on Facebook this way, saying that my father's behaving this way, they were diagnosed with this, and like he is again doing this and this, and I'm concerned, like what can we do? Like I want him to go to the hospital, but like he hasn't hurt anybody, but he's also not taking his medicine, and like he's getting, I guess at what point is it, I guess, appropriate for somebody else to try to help her? Is that possible? Like, how do you seek hospitalization for somebody, or how do you help make that happen for somebody who might not want to? Because even in conversations, I mean, so this person, after talking with them, I mean, like most people don't want to admit, perhaps because of the stigmas that, like, I know, like, I don't want to take my medicine because that means I'm crazy. Or if I don't want my brain to be messed up, so I'm not going to do these things that are being suggested for me, because like it's becoming like an identity thing. So I guess when should we take action towards hospitalization for a person? So I think there's a handful of things that you can do. Looking at risk. Are they a harm to themselves or others? Yes, they're not taking their medication, but are they being harmful? Are they hurting other people? Or could this potentially become dangerous or harmful? Also, you can call, which I found this out through just random encounter, but I had a situation where I got called into something and I didn't really know what to do. I felt like it was not tracking in the right direction. And I called one of our local mental hospitals and asked her, like, she sent me to the admissions desk and I asked her, like, this is what I've got and I'm thinking this. What are you thinking? And she's like, that's right on par. They need to go to the hospital, like right now. And so that's one way too, is to look it up and ask them, explain like what you're seeing, what's going on, because they are really all there to help you. Hospitalization is a risk. The person might not like it, but I would definitely say assessing the risk, like, because someone not taking their medication, I think what we have to learn as people, especially if we care about other people, is sometimes there's a hard line between me and what you decide to do. And if you decide not to take your medication and it's not harming everyone else, but it's harming you, but not in a like self-harm way or not a suicide way, then that might just need to be what happens if you're not ready to accept what your diagnosis is. But if it's like active threat, like you're threatening other people, like 100%, it's time to call 911 and they know what to do. They'll take them to the hospital. The hospital will de-escalate them. They'll be kicked to a mental hospital. Like, that's the process they're going to be in.
Part of the problem with, I don't even know if problem is the right, adjective to throw out there, but one of the things that you're not aware of until you walk through this with somebody is that, if you get somebody into a mental health hospital, somebody gets taken in there, and especially if it's one that's got state funding and whatnot, they're not going to go into a hospital with people who might be dealing with temporary breaks exclusively.
Yeah.
There are going to be people in there that are, in really bad way, and maybe even in a bad way long term. And so that can actually terrify a person. And because the doctors have a responsibility when it comes to releasing an individual, they have the responsibility to do it based on that individual, not on how that individual feels about their current location, geography, circumstances. And so it can create a lot of heartache and hurt and mistrust. And that person can say, why would the people around me do this to me? Or why would my doctor allow this to happen? I don't want to be in this place. But it might still be the right call. But walking through that, those are the questions that somebody will walk out of a place like that asking. They could walk out asking, saying like, I was nothing like those people. Because it's not like they're going to group everybody together and go, well, you're on this scale, so you're in this facility, and you're on this scale, you're in this facility. A lot of them are all in a more corporate environment, right?
Yeah.
And
they have a responsibility to protect. And so it can be 24. So even if you don't necessarily need to be there, it can be 24 to 72 hours. And so what I was taught was that it is a calculated risk, but you need to weigh it. And I think that that's the thing too, is weigh it. Like, okay, this person's not taking their medication. Okay. Are they hurting other people? Are they a harm to themselves, to others? Or is this frustrating to me?
Yeah.
That's not to be, I have in my family a family member that is bipolar, and it is frustrating when they cycle. Before they were properly medicated, it would be frustrating when they would cycle into mania and they're up for 4 days. That is annoying, but she wasn't harmful to anybody. When she escalated to harmful, that was when we made the call. But we really didn't have a choice. She wasn't even aware, and that was a hard thing, visiting her and then not knowing, like, is she going to be okay with the decision we made? But again, measuring, like, is this frustrating because nobody's sleeping because this person is erratic, or is this dangerous? Is this a problem?
Right. So one that came in, so we've talked a lot about seeing a counselor or contacting your doctor or getting hospitalized, things like that. How do we visit a doctor and take everything that they're saying seriously, even get your diagnosis and all that? How does somebody go through that but not take it on as their identity?
Yeah.
Like when they say, like, you are this, you are this way. And even if, again, with a doctor, we've talked about medication, only, again, sort of like pressing it down, almost like doubling down on this thing that, like, you need this because you are this way. This is your thing. This is a part of you. Like, how can someone not take that on as their identity, or what might be some helpful ways to combat those types of thoughts or feelings? Yeah,
no, I think the words you speak over yourself matter a lot. I'm not sure how aware other people are, but there's a really big push in especially the special needs community that we don't say, like, deaf child, we say this is a child with a hearing impairment. We throw the with in. This is a child with autism. This is a child with a learning disability, because it's a part of you, but it is not you. And so I think that that's important too. But I think the biggest thing is I think the biggest problem that I encounter is it can become very easy to let that be the reason that you are the way you are. And I think that it is a part of you. And yeah, there's that chemical balance, but you're also the master. You also have control over the decisions that you make. Like anxiety is not who you are. And so I think that that's huge, is that when you get the diagnosis and whatever the doctor gives you, just being intentional. And I think one thing that we don't do as well as a community of mental health is so when you get medication, your doctor might not always say you need to go to counseling, but I'm telling you, if you're on medication, you need to go to counseling, because the point is, and interestingly, anytime you read studies, like it'll say like this was really successful with this type of therapy. That's what it's supposed to be, is your medication is supposed to regulate you so that you can gain skills so that you can continue on. But I think that that's a huge part of it, is the words you speak over yourself, like, and not allowing whatever the diagnosis is be the reason, because yes, it is a motivating factor and it is something that's inside of you, but just being intentional about the fact of, okay, if I have depression, I am not depression. I am a person with depression. Does that make sense? And I think the words we say matter, and they're huge.
And what do you think, Jim?
I was just going to say, and I think consistency too, like own that. Like once you decide, what your identity is, I meet so many people who will talk about, I mean, even suicide, they'll say, well, I was at that place at one point where I was wrestling with suicide, but then, maybe we're in a small group 2 weeks later and they're sitting there going, yeah, I think about suicide. I wrestle with suicide. And then the next time that they're with somebody, they'll go, yeah, I've been in that place where I've wrestled with suicide. And then depending on who's around the room, the next time they're saying, yeah, I'm wrestling with suicide. And I get that people can come, in and out of some of those emotions, but we also have to decide like where are we right now? And those, it's not a place that we jump in and out of, our identity every day, or maybe we have even more. For me, that's a signifier that somebody needs maybe even more help. Maybe there's even more at work when their identity is always shifting, and especially if it's shifting around something that's already about mental health, and they can't decide where they're at. It's easy when we're talking about special needs, because that person has that special need and it's something that they're living with and everybody's seeing. When it comes to mental health, we want people to be healthy, but we need to own the identity of like, okay, I would say like, hey, I'm a child of God. Like God created me, He made me. I live in a broken world. There are some things that are wrong. And right now, I've had this wrestling with this, anxiety, depression, whatever it is. I think those are really acceptable, ways to navigate it. But changing your story based on who you're in the room with, examples of exceptions would be counselors and stuff but if you are just bouncing from room to room and you're using it as a way to generate, like if you're allowing your whatever it is you're dealing with, if you're using that to develop new friendships and to gain sympathy, you've got an identity issue. People need to know who you are, and they don't need to be your friend because of what you wrestle with. They don't need to feel sorry for you for what you wrestle with. We need to be engaging in life because of our potential and where we're going and what we're going to do. And hey, listen, this is coming with me right now. I don't want it to be, but it is. Or, hey, this is something I laid down in my past, or maybe there's a day where it's like, hey, everything's been really great. And I'm calling up my closest friends and going, hey, I'm having a hard time. I haven't dealt with this in a long time. But when we're using that in regular conversation of, hey, you get what I'm saying? There's an identity issue in that. And I think that it could just be because of my reference point, but I think that happens a lot in the church world.
Yeah. I think some of that too has been sort of perhaps the stigma, and we have mentioned that a number of times, but I think us learning to do some of the things that we've talked about and being the type of person who is understanding, I think will help people to embrace that, because perhaps who is in the room is important to somebody. Maybe they feel more comfortable with this particular person, makes them feel like they can share who they are.
I agree.
And I'm definitely
that
on board with you.
That one-on-one. But when it's that regular.
Oh yeah, but what you were
door,
saying, if it's constantly changing, I'm totally there. I'm just coming back. Just as soon as you said that, it just popped out that some people simply might not feel comfortable telling a particular group of people or set of people, but
because what I'll get is I'll get the phone call that goes, "Hey, I might be blowing this out of proportion. I don't know if you know this, but so and so, they just told me that that they're thinking about this," and then I'm like, okay, I go pick up the phone, and that person's like, "Oh, no, I was just saying I used to," But then I get 3 or 4 of those phone calls, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I understand. And then I have to do the due diligence, especially if it's with suicide, of making a phone call, taking it serious every time. And it's like, hey, like how do people own? How can we help them own their identity? This is why I said it's probably a signifier for something even deeper than just that one thing, because they're not even owning their own identity.
Right.
Yeah.
And that goes back to something that I think is we self-diagnose ourselves. We talked about this a little bit. So we go, oh man, my back hurts and it hurts right here. And I go online, I'm like, oh my goodness, people who have had a pain right here, it turns out to be this.
Oh no, my kidney's going bad.
Yeah. And then they walk in and they're telling everybody this is my diagnosis. And they really haven't been diagnosed. And, for them, it's a slipped vertebrae, but for everybody else, it was a tumor, and it's not the same thing. And I think the same thing happens is especially identity. I mean, we don't have time for this, but, a young person, depending on the environment that they're in, the relationship that they have, maybe they wrestle with some real identity things, their own sexuality. Well, then they go and they go on and they start researching and having conversations with people who have done that. And they go, oh, well, typically suicidal thoughts come with this, and anxiety comes with this. And I've got that. And we can sometimes just take on the identity of a lot of these things, all because we shared one experience and we never really went and sat down with somebody and said, here's what I'm going through, help me navigate it, And the problem is that for some people, it really genuinely leads them down that road. But we have a ton of people who are self-diagnosing or misdiagnosing around us. And it puts us back in that place where now we have this responsibility of weighing how critical is this? Is this really critical? And so I think the identity thing in itself is a huge issue, not just in the mental health community, but we could even say, we could go into other communities and they might even actually be a part of mental health. We need to know who we are in Christ. And, for a non-believer who would be wrestling with these things, it'd be really difficult for me to express the importance of that, because if you're created by chaos and accident, then what intent is there? And when we as children of God say, man, I was created by God with a purpose on my life, and now there are external influences in the world around me that are corrupting and maligning that, and whether that is through something that's genetically infused into who I am now through my mom and dad, or whether it's something that is a result of we see science of what happens to getting a blow to the head. It can change your entire, getting hit too hard in the head can change your entire mental state. So what are the external influences? And then, now can I take responsibility for the external influences? That's part of my identity. Part of my identity is my testimony, which is I walked through some of this and I experienced that, and it hit me in the face and I didn't expect it. And, but I'm working like everybody else, trying to find health and be a healthy person. And, again, I guess I go back to even modeling for my children. I could see how dangerous that could be for an unhealthy person, somebody who's not healthy. They could use those moments of modeling grief as ways of manipulating their kids. And it's so hard, even like to get up on a Sunday and teach some practical lessons sometimes, because people they don't take responsibility for their actions, their identity, or their mental health. It's hard to say, do this, this, and this, because some people will go, oh, well, what's the language? Somebody told me recently, they said they're going to continue to do that because it served them well.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so some people will continue to quote unquote love a certain way because it serves them, not because they genuinely care for other people. And as soon as it stops serving, you see a different part of who they are. And, you know, when it comes to having an issue, I think it's okay to say, this is something I wrestle with. This is something I want to be set free from. I've had that conversation with people all the time. And I've got a friend of mine who's, you know, even, you know, recently expressed like, you know, I want the day to come where I'm not having to manage this, but today I'm managing it. You know, that's, for me, that's a much healthier place to be than to pretend like it's not there until the right person walks in the room. And then it serves me to tell you this. That's, again, we get back into that less resourceful behavior. And that's a less resourceful behavior for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as we close, I guess I just want to ask the both of you, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share? Anything that's just come to mind that we maybe haven't touched on, or anything that you just want to affirm or just wrap this thing up with, Jovanna or Jim?
Yeah. No, I think what I hope people know is that that they can advocate for themselves. Like, I try to think back to why I know that, but I really think it's because I had like my first like on my own doctor experience. I had such a great doctor. Like, I go with a notebook because, you know, your yearly is spread apart. And so, and I'm on, just me personally, on my own anxiety journey. And it's, my goal is to be off of medication. I'm not saying that should be everybody's goal, but I think that that's a good goal to have. And that's something that I talked to her about. Like, when she prescribed me medication, I came in a month later and she was surprised I even came. Like, because she said most people don't show up. And that's crazy to me. So show up. And I took track of, like, she told me verbatim, like, it might take 2 weeks. You might be really sleepy. And then after that, but if you have any problems, let me know. And I did pay attention to that. Like, okay, I am sleepy, but like, is this too much? Like, and that's a part of it, my anxieties. I'm overly aware of myself. But I do think knowing that you have that, and I know that for some, they need that permission, and if you do, I'm giving you that permission, that if you have been given a diagnosis, I'm giving you permission to ask more questions. And there's great websites, mental health websites, where you can understand it more and get yourself into counseling, because even the stuff that you were saying, yes, we can only give advice on a surfacey level. But the whole point of counseling, the whole point of even if you decided, I don't want to do counseling, but you get a mentor or a coach, all three of those relationships are personalized. And I think that is the thing. That's the key, because why we're motivated to do the things we do is all different. And so that's my encouragement, is for you to know that you can advocate for yourself. If you're feeling something, talk to the appropriate circle, talk to a friend that you know that's been in counseling, talk to a friend that you know has a good primary care doctor. But these are internal events that I can't see. Like, I know a lot of people who have depression who are pretty bubbly people, and that's an internal event. That's their dark night of the soul that I don't know about. But, and so knowing that this is something internal, like, that is, and not to be overly, like, I don't want it to sound like judgmental, but this is you. You're responsible for your mind and your body and your spirit. Like, you have a responsibility in that. Like, there's different dividends about how much responsibility, but you have a responsibility. And so know that you have permission to speak up for yourself.
Then I would say that to remember that, you know, your mental health is, you know, very similar in nature to your physical health. And, you know, just because, you know, you get the flu, doesn't mean you're done. And so, you know, you take care of that. And it's the same, like, you might be 45 years old and you might wake up and be like, oh, I'm experiencing something I've never experienced before. Take it seriously, and, you know, go through the process of trying to get health. The truth is that you know, from what I've read, the vast majority of people who are wrestling with mental health, you know, the majority of them, it's a short-term thing. It's something that their body's cycling through, their life cycling through. And if they'll be serious about it, they can walk through it. And that's not for everybody. And there are a lot of inhibitors and things that will change that. The other thing I'll say is that, I think that, the resources like this, I think are most practical probably for people who are not wrestling with stuff. We who are, those of us who are in the position of probably being, maybe I would say, healthier mentally. It doesn't mean that we're perfect, but if you're in a position where you're like, hey, things are pretty good for me, you need to be aware of what this looks like, so you can look for the signifiers or the signs in the lives of the people around you. Don't wait until, don't wait to have some understanding around mental health until somebody you care about is falling apart.
Yeah.
This is one of the things we do when we talk about, things that take lives, right? So we talk about a mass shooting, and what does everybody do? And they're all researching gun deaths and how do we stop that? And how do we avoid it? And when we talk about cancer and what are we doing? It's like, what foods do I eat that make a difference here? I think that mental health is something we should be in the same position of, what are the things we can be doing to make sure that we're healthy and that we're helping to make sure our children are healthy. I don't just sit down and feed my kids hot dogs and cheese puffs at every meal. They might enjoy that, but I understand that while, it might not, make them obese today, long term, the health consequences are pretty bad. And so I'm working with them to help them understand that, they've got to eat healthy. Well, I want to be doing the same thing with mental health. I want to teach them how to grieve and mourn and laugh and, experience all the emotions that are there. And that would just be my encouragement. Consuming resources like this are really just getting you some broad strokes on this stuff. And then as you're researching it, be careful who you research. I always pick on Justin Bieber, and I always have somebody come back at me and ask me why I pick on Justin Bieber. When he was 15, I did not, somebody came to me one day with one of his songs, and they were like, listen to these lyrics. It's like he's reading my soul, like he's deep inside of me. And I'm like, wow. He's a 15-year-old singing about love, right? It's like he hasn't lived enough life to really understand the type of love he's talking about. Now, my understanding is Justin Bieber's a good guy, so I'm not slamming him. And he was 15, he had producers and people shoving stuff towards him. But, my advice would never be go to a 15-year-old to, for counseling on fixing your marriage. You know what I'm saying? It's the same thing with mental health. Don't go to, somebody who's not healthy with their mental state and ask them to fix you. One, that doesn't take it seriously. And, if you're really in a dark place, just because your neighbor makes good casseroles doesn't mean they can, fix you. Go to people who have better tools in their belt. So.
Right on. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jovanna, for being here. That's all the time that we have for today. Thank you, everyone who is checking out the podcast. Again, check the link in the description below for part 1. You'll want to check that out as well. All the content we just covered is different than what we covered on Sunday. So, again, we believe your best days are ahead. Thanks for checking it out. We love you. Go and change your world.